Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with critically acclaimed pianist, composer, and producer Natalie Tenenbaum. We cover her new 2024 CD, The Piano Reimagined, and her life in music. She is a graduate of the Juilliard School and has appeared as a soloist and with orchestras in Israel, Europe, Asia, and the United States, performing in venues like the Kennedy Center, Lincoln Center, Jerusalem Music Center, and beyond. It's a fascinating story. Enjoy. Well, it's great to meet you. Thank you for taking a minute out for the show today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Thank you for thinking of me and for having me on your show. It's an honor for me, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. I would love to begin our conversation before we get into the Piano Reimagined by asking you, we're looking at the calendar today. 4 years ago, we were coming to grips with this pandemic that really ravaged the musicians' world. How did you survive that time period? How did it change you?
Oh wow, that's an amazing and hard question. It was crazy. I feel like my whole sort of I don't want to say mission statement, but just sort of goals and the way I see things shifted so drastically as a result of the pandemic, as I'm sure it has for many. As far as my piano and sort of artist musician life, I kind of went into the pandemic. What I was doing before the pandemic was, I was working on projects that were, I was working on my own music and recording always and composing always and performing, but I was primarily sort of busy with doing work for, sort of like third-party projects. Like I was working on Broadway projects, I was doing some video games, I was working on film and TV stuff, and sort of, being music director for other artists or playing in bands of other artists. And then when we went into the pandemic, I just really, we were so isolated. So I feel like we had no choice but sort of really try to bring to fruition. And for me, at least, I can only speak for myself, but I had all that time to really sort of revisit these old sort of goals and dreams and concepts and projects that I had dreamed up in the past and maybe didn't have the time to finalize and really bring to fruition and complete, and finally take the steps to doing them. And this album, actually, Piano Reimagined, is one of those things. And prior to that, since we're in Neon Jazz, was actually a more sort of jazz album that came out in August of 2023, which that whole album was sort of created during the pandemic. So it's an album of myself and my collaborator on it, which is a wonderful jazz pianist. His name is Eitan Kenner. I don't know if you're familiar, but him and I collaborated on that album, and we didn't even meet before the pandemic. We met online during the pandemic, and we just would get on long sort of Zoom sessions and FaceTime calls and just play for each other and talk about improvisation and all of our inspirations. And he taught me so much, and I'd like to believe vice versa as well. And we sort of, came up with this whole idea of making this 2-piano album called Duet Solos, which came out on Lars Ove Records this past summer. And we're very, very proud of it. But that's like a pandemic baby because we didn't even know each other before the pandemic. But even aside from that album and the one we're about to discuss, there's several other projects that I feel like, it was the worst time, as I'm sure you would agree. The pandemic was horrible, but as far as just sort of allowing that sort of pause to really focus on certain artistic directions, it was in a way kind of, I don't know that I would be talking to you today, about these albums had we not had that moment to just kind of pause and revisit those artistic ideas and actually scheme out how to bring them into life, if that makes sense.
It certainly does. And I hear that a lot. There was a lot of things that were good about slowing down, aside from all the woe we were going through. So let's focus in on the Piano Reimagined. Talk to me about this project, how it came about, kind of the general artistic vision.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Piano Reimagined was sort of like a working title, and we ended up settling the sort of formal official title of the album, which is coming out in June, the title is Standard Repertoire Volume 1. So the sort of thought behind that I've had for many years again, and finally it's coming out. I'm so excited. The thought I had behind that was, my background. If we were to just look back for a minute, my background is in classical piano and composition. So I studied at the Juilliard School. My degree is in piano performance. I toured with orchestras and played recitals, playing sort of very, as the title suggests, standard repertoire as far as Bach and Liszt and Debussy, Chopin, et cetera, for many years. And now that I kind of do other things and primarily focus on sound design and composition and jazz, improvisation, all these other things, I felt like I was ready to put out an album of sort of my own current interpretation of that canonical, maybe I'm not saying it right, but I'm saying, like, of the canon, these classical pillars that have really shaped sort of my DNA and how I think of music and how I, sort of like these iconic pieces that I've played for decades, really. And I felt finally ready to sort of put out a recording. And as I was thinking and programming the album and thinking, okay, it's going to go from Bach to Chopin to Debussy, Stravinsky, Liszt, etc. It came to me sort of this vision of interlacing it with original music and sound design, like I just mentioned, and the way it all came together is sort of in broad strokes. There's interludes in there and postludes and sort of original compositions, and it kind of goes. The whole album, it's supposed to be a listening experience. It all segues into each other. So there's like an original piece of music that opens the album, and then it kind of segues into the Bach chromatic fantasy. And then the whole album continues in that vein where from Bach, it goes into another original, and then from there into Debussy, and then into another original, and so on and so forth. And I really tried to make it cohesive in a way where, it was really just transitioning from one to the next. And then the classical pieces themselves, my sort of vision at this point in time, maybe in the future, I will get into the studio again and record them again and just do it, like cleanly, so to speak, just sort of acoustic and as intended. But for this album, why it was originally titled Reimagined is I took these pieces and put a spin on them as far as sound design and kind of, portraying it through the lens of how I'm seeing them now, not only with where I'm at right now artistically and what I'm involved with, but also with the compositions that are original that are now surrounding them on the album, if that makes sense. So kind of creating these like soundscapes and bringing the classical pieces into that and including them in that, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes total sense. I'm curious, what are you hoping the listener gets from this album?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I feel like as far as the tracks vary as far as familiarity. I don't know if that your typical classical listener will certainly recognize the Liszt, Campanella, and Chopin, Etude, and Petrushka by Stravinsky, and everything. So for that listener, sort of avatar profile, who's sort of like a classical or pseudo-classical listener who enjoys listening to classical music, I hope this is refreshing to them in a way, as opposed to sacrilegious, I guess. But like a refreshing sort of new take on these classics. And for listeners who perhaps don't listen to a lot of classical music, my hope is that some of the other sort of material on the album helps sort of draw them in, and maybe through listening to these renditions, they become as infatuated with these pieces that I obviously have always been and still am, and explore the canon of recordings, which is endless. Each of these pieces have been recorded by all the greats, right? There's so many beautiful recordings of Rubinstein and Argerich, and so hopefully this can then take them on the journey to discover further into the classical music. So, for those two types of listeners, your typical classical and your non-typical classical listener, that's sort of as far as, again, a mission statement of some kind. And then in general, my hope is for people to take the time, and if they can, listen throughout from the beginning to the end and go on this journey that myself and my co-producer really, we worked on this for many, many months, and we're very, very proud of artistically and the feel and the vibe of the album from beginning to end, and some of the messaging. So hopefully people can take that in and enjoy that.
So, Natalie, how did this journey into the music begin for you? Take me back to where you were born and raised and how this became your life.
Sure. You mean into music just sort of in general as a career? And
yeah, just in general, just I guess kind of from your beginnings of how music became your passion and how it turned into a career.
Sure. Yeah. So I was born in Los Angeles. And I was actually raised shortly after I was born, my parents moved to Israel. So I was raised in between LA and Israel because they were going back and forth a little bit. And then I went into studying classical and jazz music sort of concurrently when I was in Israel throughout my education and throughout high school. And then after high school, I got into both Berklee School of Music in Boston for studying jazz, and into Juilliard in New York to go and study classical piano. And my choice was to go study classical piano at Juilliard. So I was very lucky to be able to attend there and get my bachelor's of music in classical piano performance. But I always knew I liked, obviously, I mean, having considered going into the jazz realm and improvising and writing music more specifically, I always knew that that's what I would end up doing. So after I finished Juilliard, I sort of got involved in several scenes in New York and did some work in the new music scene, working with new composers and premiering works with several ensembles and various venues and whatnot. But I also kind of got into working with on the jazz scene, and also on sort of like the theatrical scene in New York, doing some Broadway projects and touring with various artists. But I always sort of kept up, obviously, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, I love playing classical music and writing sort of very pianistically, compositions for solo piano and piano for other instruments and piano and electronics. So I always continued to do that. And I feel like now, and you mentioned the pandemic, I love that was your first question. That was brilliant, because I feel like the pandemic sort of really brought me into focus of like, okay, let's try to release a lot of that music that I've really been creating now for almost, I want to say almost 2 decades, and haven't really been sort of putting out, because I've been, blissfully, and I feel very blessed to say this, I've been very lucky to be busy working on various other, projects throughout the years. So finally now I feel like I'm excited to release, what was just released this summer, what's going to come out, what we're talking about now, which will come out in June. And then after that, there's going to be another album. So very, very exciting time.
So talk to me a little bit about what's the best part about being a professional musician for you?
Everything. I just love it. I can't imagine doing anything else. It's a juggling act. I mean, obviously it's fun to put out albums, and I will, hopefully I'm lucky enough to get to continue to do that for many years to come. But obviously there's a lot more that goes into it, as far as playing shows and collaborating with other artists, and everything that goes into it. As far as for me, I mean, living in New York, there's just so much that you as an artist kind of have to do in order to kind of make it work, So being able to balance everything really keeps it interesting for me, because I get a nice variety of different projects and different people that I get to connect with and work with. I'd say that's a big part of it at this point, because what originally, started out as a pretty lonely kind of journey. I mean, coming out of Juilliard, doing, classical piano at Juilliard, I practiced for probably, I want to say between 6 to 8 hours every day for 4 years by myself in a small little room. So that was a little bit lonely. And I feel like coming out of that and starting to work professionally, what has been amazing on every front. I mean, whether it was, playing in sort of jazz bands, or if it's touring with a production, or if it's writing, co-writing with other people, collaborating on producing, whatever it may be, TV, film, what have you. It's just the beauty of being able to create art and sit at the keyboard or whatever it is, and be with other people and share and exchange ideas and get to connect with other people and learn from them. I feel like that's really where it's at for me at this point. And this album actually is a lot of it I did do by myself. I mean, I ultimately, to finalize everything, I worked with my co-producer very closely, but it was just the two of us, with a couple of guests, including jazz drummer Brian Carter, actually, who's a very dear friend of mine, who collaborated on one track on the album. But the next album will definitely be a lot of collaborations. And that's just kind of like what I love most, is just being able to share this love of music and write music for other people and then hear it performed. I mean, there's really nothing like it.
So at the end of the day, Natalie, everyone has a perception of you, your family, your friends, your fans, but you're ultimately in charge. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Oh, wow. That's a deep question. Do you mean as far as just in general, or like artistically, specifically with music?
I think the Venn diagram kind of bleeds into itself. It's just kind of everybody has this role that people see you in life, but ultimately you're the driving force of your ed. So what is your idea of who you think you are?
Wow. I mean, I'd say I have two little kids now. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old. That's also a new addition since the pandemic. The first one was more of a pandemic baby. The second one is, luckily, we're out of that now. Thank God. Let's let it continue. But yeah, I mean, being a mom to these two kids has been so transforming in every single way. And also musically, it was so inspiring to be a mom now and everything. So obviously family first, always, and then, friends and the beautiful circle of humans that are around me. I mean, that's being with them and being the best that I can for them is the number one thing that's the most important to me. And sort of in addition to that, and not secondary, but in addition to that, obviously music and the arts, and trying to every day just wake up and create and be present with what is, and try to do the best that I can with every single day, and hope to bring it to the world and get to impact people positively. And I hope that's a good answer.
That is. That's an excellent answer.
Like where I'm at.
Yeah, no, it's a hard one, but that was excellent. So if anyone wants to pick up the new album, see you live, any of the good business, where do they go?
Oh, great question. So I'm doing a few shows in Europe next month in May. I'm going to be in Poland and Vienna and London, and that should be. I'm actually going to be updating my website today for that. So my website is natalietenenbaum.com, and that stays pretty active. And the social media platforms on Instagram, Natalie Tenenbaum, very active there. And as far as in the US, I'm playing at Times Square, actually. It's an outdoor concert. My concert is going to be presented by Carnegie Hall. So it's Carnegie Hall citywide. I'm going to be premiering some works from the album. That's why we did the concert on June 13th, which is around the time that the full album will be out. So I hope anybody in the New York, the tri-state area can come out. It will be at 6 p.m. And there's several other upcoming 2024-25 US dates that will also be updated this week on my albums. On my website. So I hope to stay in touch with everybody listening and get to see and meet everybody.
Excellent. This has been wonderful, Natalie. Thank you for your story. Yeah. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks for listening and tuning into another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players and minds in Israel, New York City, Kansas City, and spots all over the globe, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Natalie for her time, energy, and story. If you want to hear more Neon Jazz interviews, you can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Subscribe to us at YouTube, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to theneonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends. Hey Jazz fans, Joe Domino here, the host of the weekly Neon Jazz radio show and regular interview series being produced and distributed from Lee Summit, Missouri. We are quite excited to let you know about the first annual Lee Summit Jazz Fest taking place this summer on June 22nd, 2024 at the Bridge Space located at 210 Southwest Market Street. There will be 8 robust acts, including the Back Alley Brass Band and the great Lee Summit Jazz Orchestra. There will also be art vendors and food trucks to make this a must-attend event. All details can be found at www.bridgespace.us/jazz. We will see you there.
Neon Jazz.
Hey Jazz fans, Joe Domino here, the host of the weekly Neon Jazz radio show and regular interview series being produced and distributed from Lee Summit, Missouri. We are quite excited to let you know about the first annual Lee Summit Jazz Fest taking place this summer on June 22nd, 2024 at the Bridge Space located at 210 Southwest Market Street. There will be 8 robust acts, including the Back Alley Brass Band and the great Lee Summit Jazz Orchestra. There will also be art vendors and food trucks to make this a must-attend event. All details can be found at www.bridgespace.us/jazz. We will see you there.